Chapter 18, Part 2, the Enlightenment. This is the second major intellectual concept of the chapter. The first was the scientific revolution, and it really was the cause of the Enlightenment, scientifically, of course. And then the second part, the Enlightenment, consists of the new philosophy, approaches to learning and government, and more of that other area of life. So first comes science, then the effects of it are seen in other areas of life. So there's central concepts of the Enlightenment. This is around 1750. Put the date in your notes, 1750. These are like the first social scientists, people that study humanity, human behavior, psychology, sociology. This all goes back to the beginning of the Enlightenment. All right. So this is number one, reason. The Enlightenment is about using reason and rationalism. This means you want to apply scientific principles to examine all areas of human life. That's an important definition. No longer using superstition or simply believing something that someone tells you, or even just trusting in what you see, but using reason and a critical spirit to come to knowledge. That's what we mean by reason. Two, how does this come to conflict with in other areas? Well, it primarily is going to conflict with religion. As you well know, certain aspects of religion you have to accept on faith, and that is not going to be part of the Enlightenment. You must prove something, at least they thought they needed to prove it. Okay? Second main concept, science can be used to find laws of human nature, much like science in the Sci-Rev was used to find laws of the physical world and actual nature. Now we want to take it a step further, and science will be used to find the things that govern human behavior. They said that everything can be figured out. Everything can be calculated and researched and proven. So it's the birth of social science, as I said a minute ago, and research. We have critical research now where you can study any problem from a scientific point of view. This is like what goes on in universities today. There are social science departments, and people study human behavior with as much passion and methodology as they study diseases or genetics or something like that that's more a hard science. The same principles are applied starting in the Enlightenment and carrying through to the present day to study human issues. A belief in progress, number three. They were very optimistic. They believed that by doing this, we could make a better world. We could improve the human condition. Four, secularism. It's a secular thing. It's worldly. It comes from kind of the Renaissance tradition. They don't turn to religion for answers anymore. They're not looking in the Bible for explanations of human behavior. They're looking to science and research and inquiry. Number five, a profound impact of the Enlightenment takes place in both the middle and upper or aristocratic classes. So whereas the Renaissance was primarily upper class only, now the Enlightenment is among middle classes as well, business people, okay, self-made people. Of course, who's not affected by the Enlightenment for hundreds of years? The poor, the peasants, the commoners, the working man, not a part of it. Okay, let's move forward. Section B, the emergence of the Enlightenment. Starts with really a guy named Fontenelle, who sort of bridges the gap between the Sci-Rev and the Enlightenment, because his books are about popular science. He takes these scientific concepts like the heliocentric theory, which would have been written in Latin, first of all, by people that certainly wouldn't have been able to understand it at the common level. But they took these high-level things and he wrote them in a way that ordinary people could understand. That's what we mean by popular science. It's for a non-scientific audience. So he popularizes the discoveries of the scientific revolution. And the famous book he did this in was called Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. And it's a romance book and also a science book at the same time. In this book, a scientist goes on dates with a woman, and they go walking through beautiful parks in the moonlight. And he weaves all this science into this really romantic tale. And the guy tells this woman that he's on a date with, he explains the new models of the universe to her in a very romantic way as they sit under the stars together. And so it appeals to people for a variety of reasons. It combines science and human behavior, which is the Enlightenment. So he's kind of the first guy to write a book that gets people interested in new ways of thinking. This is like, think of popular science today. Movies, books that combine either science fiction or real science with a love story. And there's lots out there, but I thought of Star Wars. There's always a love story, but then there's these incredible, scientific theories being put out too, or maybe Star Trek, if you ever saw that. Those are popular science that make people interested and want to know more about what they're seeing. So the Renaissance, here's a little distinction here. The Renaissance looked backward for answers, and you should know where they looked, to the classical world. That's in the past. The Sirev takes a different approach from this point on. They look forward. We're looking to the future for answers, pushing the knowledge forward, not looking back anymore. The Romans and the Greeks were great at philosophy, but so much of their science was wrong. We're not going to look to that anymore. We're going to do new things. All right. Science began to conflict with religion for a number of people at this point. This is kind of the origin of this. Not for all, but for a lot of these new philosophers and scientists, there is going to be a conflict. Who's the exception to this, as we learned the last time? Isaac Newton. There were very important and prestigious scientists that never lost their religious faith, and Isaac Newton was one of them. But for some people, they're going to see this trouble. And truth and morality to some of these new philosophers is now going to be seen as relative, meaning it can change depending on how you see it, rather than absolute. So truth and morality for some of the Enlightenment philosophers is relative, not absolute. One of the other most important Enlightenment early writers is John Locke, and I know you've studied him at some point, most likely. Famous Enlightenment philosopher from England. His essay concerning human understanding sets out his whole framework for learning and knowledge. He wrote the Treatise of Government, the two treatises on civil government, from the last chapter 16 when we studied the English development of constitutionalism. Same guy. So he was both a political writer as well as a philosopher. And in his famous book concerning human understanding, he writes about the tabula rasa, the blank slate. And he said, all of us are born with a blank slate. It's not predetermined. He's certainly not a Calvinist where life has been predestined a certain way. Every human being is born with a blank slate, a blank mind, and it's how that mind is written on is what determines your life. And what are the main things that impact your blank slate? It's the education, the social life that you grew up in, the institutions around you, like your schooling, your family, your government. These things are what determines a human being's future. No one is born predisposed to failure or success. It's your surroundings, your environment that makes the difference. The family, the government, the churches, all of it, the different organizational institutions in society. So isn't that a very optimistic view of humanity, isn't it? That no one is born with a fate sealed, that it's up to you, but honestly, it's up to those who raise you when you're a child, because he said the most important thing is for these things to be positive when you're from a baby to those first few years of life. That really sets you up almost for your whole future. It's blank, but you better put the right things on that blank slate right away, otherwise it goes off track. So John Locke, the incredibly positive view of human beings. Okay. The philosophes and the public. Now, the word philosophe is going to be, that's how you pronounce it. It means a philosopher, and they're French. Now, the French philosophes are the leaders of the Enlightenment, okay? They're the ones that push everything forward. The Enlightenment is predominantly a French thing. There's some Englishmen tossed in here and there, like Locke, but mainly it's French, okay? And the word means philosopher. And why is France the center of the Enlightenment? Because it was a wealthy country. The French language was the international language of the elite people, which had replaced Latin. So that's all because of Louis XIV being an absolute monarch. They were everyone was trying to imitate French culture at this point, and including some of that is the work of the philosophers. There's less censorship in France than in other places, particularly, even though Louis XIV was an absolute monarch, he kind of tolerated a little bit of this going on under the surface, not as harsh as let's say Eastern Europe, so a little bit there. The French philosophes, why is it French? Because they asked the fundamental questions of life that no one else was asking at the time, like what is the nature of good and bad, and what is God, who is God, and what is the meaning of life, and what is human nature? Is it good or is it evil? They really did ask these questions that no one was asking at the time. A very, very important set of questions. Okay? Let's go on here. The public in the Enlightenment. The public. The philosophers are big on the public. They said these ideas need to reach a public audience. But by that, they meant elite people only, sort of upper class people only. Okay? So they always, when they say the public and the public, they mean the middle and upper class. They don't have a very high opinion of common people. Common people to Enlightenment philosophers were stupid, dumb, confused, and poor, and had no business partaking of any of this. That's a lot like the Renaissance too, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of similarities. So it's elite. It's a movement of elite people and by and for middle and elite people, middle class and elite people. Okay, and despite their, that they weren't totally shut down censorship-wise, they had to be sort of secretive in their writing. They had to use satire, and they had to hide their thoughts in comedy form. Because otherwise they might get sent off to the Bastille, a famous prison, and like Voltaire actually had to go there for a while. So there were punishments if you went and crossed the line, but for the most part, you could kind of get away with it as long as you couched your theories in popular science or in satire. Montesquieu, the next most important person of the Enlightenment, the Baron de Montesquieu, French. Okay, he writes a critique of European society in the book called Persian Letters, and here's how he got away with it. He did it from the point of view of a Persian traveler, someone from the Middle East, seeing Europe for the first time and asking questions about it, and why does this society look the way it does? So by doing it like that, he got away with really, attacking the society that he lived in, Persian Letters. So he's pointing out what's wrong with our own world. Now, his most famous book, though, is The Spirit of the Laws, and this is his political work, in which he calls for a separation of powers. Really fundamental change here. We need to have, this is what keeps people safe and prevents abuse, is to have not one particular institution with all the power. So the king is distinct from the parliament, and the parliament is distinct from the courts, or the legal system. And when we keep these three things around, not one of them dominates the other, we have our liberties protected. So we love Montesquieu, and our whole Constitution in America is based on his ideas. We have a separate executive, legislative, and judicial, but that starts in England, and he was a big fan of England. English Parliament, actually, was his big model for writing this book. And he loved the fact that Parliament was supreme in England because Parliament was elected and represented the people. He was also a big fan in France of the Parlement, which are the court system that was arising in France at the time. In the Enlightenment, there was a system where there was nobility that formed these courts, and they gained the right to review the king's decisions. This is not under Louis XIV. This is under Louis XV, actually, the next king of France, who was a little bit softer on this. So he really likes any time that some power can check another power. The Spirit of the Laws. Let's do Voltaire. Where is he? There he is. Voltaire is maybe the most famous Enlightenment philosopher of all time. Voltaire is a Frenchman. That's not his real name, that's his pen name. His real name was Jean-François Arouet, but he went by Voltaire. And this guy is sort of like the poster boy for the Enlightenment. He was, first of all, a good-looking gentleman, very young and attractive, and he lived this incredible, turbulent life. He was a world figure. He was internationally known. He was a celebrity intellectual. So I think, are there any celebrity intellectuals today that you're aware of? He was also kind of a cynical guy. He really attacked lots of what he saw around him and made fun of it, and used a lot of satire. He was very liberal for his day, very liberal in terms of his views on government and women and his own and religion. He was also known for his extensive romances. He was known to, he had lots of different women in his life over the years. He was rumored to be involved with even different empresses and high-level political women. Occasionally, he was rumored to be linked with men as well. So he lived this kind of really, celebrity. A lot of gossip was written about him, this kind of thing. Early in his life, and as a Frenchman, he wrote an attack on the king, on Louis XIV, and he put him in the prison for a while. He put him in the Bastille, which was a famous prison in Paris. And so he had spent time behind bars, actually, and then he would flee to England for a while and live in England for years and write there, and then he'd come back to France. Then he'd go live in Prussia for a while and work for the Fredericks. And then he'd correspond with the Russian Romanovs. So he was well known all over Europe. Very important guy. He fought against legal injustice. That's probably the most important thing in his life. He fought against injustice and being attacked for your beliefs, legal injustice. He fought the man, he fought the powers that be. And he had like a sharp tongue, almost like an acid tongue. He was so witty. And he would make fun of you without you even knowing what he just did. He was, almost dancing circles around people intellectually. He was a real fan and friend of a woman named Madame de Châtelet. Madame de Châtelet was an important female participant in the Enlightenment. She was a patron of scientists, and she was also a scientist herself. And she was rich. She had a rich husband and a lot of time on her hands, and I said, I like this Voltaire guy. I want to bring him into my home. And they lived together, and they worked together. And Madame de Châtelet translated Isaac Newton into French. And Madame de Châtelet was an advocate for women. There she is, Émile de Châtelet. And she and Voltaire became intellectual partners. Some people thought that they were romantically linked as well. There was a lot of talk about Voltaire in his life, but she was his patron, basically. She paid his salary while he wrote his work. So an incredible story between these two. But Madame de Châtelet was important in her own right. Okay, and she said, she wrote this about, she attacked the limited and unequal education of women. And she said, I would reform an abuse which cuts off, so to speak, half the human race. I would make women participate in all the rights of humankind, and above all, in those of the intellect. So she was an advocate for the education of women, an early feminist, and Voltaire was right there with her most of their life. Voltaire at times was also the court historian to Louis XIV. He made up with him. He was in jail as a younger man, but then he made his peace, and everyone recognized how talented he was. They had to have him work for them. And then later on in life, he went and worked for Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Frederick was his patron. And he lived in Berlin for a while, Voltaire, and he wrote and was sponsored by the King of Prussia. And they were rumored to have some sort of relationship together as well. So this guy was all over, the man about Europe, for sure. And then even later in life, he was working, he corresponded with Catherine the Great of Russia. Again, lots of stuff here. Voltaire's opinions on government, he said, he was sort of pessimistic about government. He goes, maybe a good, strong monarch is the best we can hope for. He certainly was no fan of democracy. He did not believe in the rights of commoners by any means. But maybe like a benevolent monarch. He saved his biggest criticism in life for the Catholic Church. He hated religious intolerance. He had a view of religion that we call deism. It's important, D-E-I-S-M. And this is the clockmaker view of the universe, where he saw God as had sort of made the universe like winding up a watch. He set it in motion, but was very distant and not involved in the affairs of humanity once the universe and mankind was created. So that's a view that's a distant view of God. It's deism. It's what a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers believed, and Voltaire was one of the first to do so. He was not a part of any organized religion, but he certainly did believe in God, but not the same type of God that people believed in that were fighting in the religious wars that said it's this or I'm going to murder you. He couldn't stand religious intolerance, and he criticized the Catholic Church throughout most of his life. That's Voltaire. All right, let's move on. Let's go to the guys that wrote the encyclopedia. Diderot and D'Alembert are also French philosophes. This is a big deal. This is 1765, the year they were the first to write a 17-volume collection of all the knowledge at the time that they wanted to publish, an encyclopedia. And it was from A to Z. They wrote articles and collected things from scholars, and here it is, the world's first published encyclopedia. And you know what? People didn't like it. Shocker. The kings of France banned the book, said don't read it because it will provoke rebellion. It was put on the do not read list by the Catholic Church as well, the index of prohibited books. Knowledge is dangerous, and people did not like it that there was publishing of new approaches to science and critical thinking. And it's revolutionary. Its goal was to change the general view of life. It really was. It was published in Switzerland. Eventually, Catherine the Great of Russia is going to help publish it. But where it was written, which is Western Europe, it was certainly not. It was not acceptable. Science and industry were exalted. Religion and immorality were questioned. Intolerance, legal injustice, and social institutions were openly criticized. Political topics were there that had never been published before. So yeah, it was a big deal. It was very progressive, and it was to promote the general well-being. The Encyclopedia. All right, let's go on. The later Enlightenment. It starts to break down a little bit. The agreement, these early belief in progress and rationalism starts to break down a little bit in the second phase of the Enlightenment as we move towards 1770, 80, 90. The later Enlightenment philosophers were more rigid, they were harsher, they were more pessimistic. They would attack the first generation of scholars. Maybe an example is Holbach here, who's the first documented atheist. His system of nature reduces man to a machine, and we're simply the product of inertia and chance and randomness, and he really did outright deny the existence of God in the book of Genesis and creation. So that sort of doesn't fit with some of the earlier stuff. So he kind of is a polarizing figure. And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Swiss guy, a Swiss philosopher, kind of a loner. We call him the first romantic, not because he was involved with lots of women, but because he believed in looking back at the past as maybe where more answers were. He said, you got to trust your heart more often here, not your head. The first phase of the Enlightenment was so rational and so rigid that it took away the meaning of life, and that we have to have feeling and intuition and emotion, and that matters. You can't have everything cold and calculated. That's what romantics are about. You trust your heart, and you just let it take you places, and you don't just try to figure everything out. So he kind of attacked the first generation of scholars. His most famous quote was that man is free, but yet everywhere he is in chains to this intellect, to this rigid thinking of the universe. So Rousseau was an interesting guy. He didn't really fit the mold. He wrote extensively about education, about child raising, and we'll take a look at some of his stuff in class. In politics, he wrote about the social contract, which is when people come in to form a government. You make a social contract with one another where you give up certain rights in exchange for protection. He said this is the key to having a peaceful society, is that we enter into an agreement with each other, a social contract. And sometimes it means we have to do things we don't want to do or give up something we don't want to give up. And sometimes what society needs is not what people would vote for necessarily. That would be, he called this thing the general will. There's this general will of what we need that not everyone recognizes, but the job of good government is to provide for the general will, which might be unpopular at the time, but it might be what people actually need. So that's a little bit complicated, but that's all right. Urban culture and public opinion. So as part of the Enlightenment, the market for books goes way up. People are now reading books on all kinds of subjects they've never read on before. People start accumulating private libraries and collecting things, and they want books on all different topics, from art to and science. Those are going up. Books on religion are going down. Middle-class people are reading, nobles are reading, not commoners yet, not peasants. But there's this big book trade that starts to emerge in Europe. Think of like Barnes and Noble and the culture of reading and acquiring books that we have today, whether electronic or regular. But that sort of starts back here in the Enlightenment. And the big advocate for reading and publishing is Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher of the Enlightenment, who is so big on freedom of the press and the ability to publish and not have censorship. He said the most important thing is that you exercise your reason publicly. You have to debate, and this is what scholars do. You publish, and then you use words to attack people, not swords and weapons. So this is the beginning of freedom of the press. Where does the Enlightenment take place? A lot of it is behind closed doors, actually, in particularly France. The Enlightenment happened in these places called salons. They're drawing rooms. That's the word. The translation is like a drawing room. And it's like the living room of a really rich person in a townhouse in Paris. And because it was still kind of, you couldn't publish totally openly in Paris, this is, you have dinner, you'd have, a meal together, and then you'd shut the doors of your townhouse and you'd invite a philosopher over for the evening. And they would tell you about what they'd written. And it was conversations would happen here in these salons, and they became kind of unofficial meeting places for the philosophers of the Enlightenment and the people that wanted to learn from them. And this is where the Enlightenment happened. The Enlightenment was not happening, they weren't publishing in newspapers, they were publishing kind of under the table here, behind closed doors in the homes of these wealthy patrons, kind of like the Renaissance. So the role of women in this was really important. Rich women became the hostesses or the sponsors of these salons. And the most famous of them was a woman named Madame Geoffrin. We'll get to her in a minute. And because of this role, women were big participants in the Enlightenment. So let's get this down. This is an advancement for women. There's a huge feminine influence on the Enlightenment, and there was an Enlightenment influence on women. And it was, like I said, a real step forward. There was the art of the Enlightenment takes on a very feminine style. We're going to call it Rococo. We'll get to that soon here. The emergence of polite society and this culture of literate people can be attributed to the manners and grace of women. There's sort of a civilizing effect on men, that men become nicer and gentler because women are around in these discussions. There's no equal rights. Don't make any mistake. There's not a political advancement for women, but there's an intellectual advancement through the culture of these salons. Madame Geoffrin is the lead figure in the Parisian Enlightenment culture. She was a famous Enlightenment hostess who had a twice-a-week meeting of a salon in her home. She was a financial patron of the encyclopedia, and she was part of these circles. So she's a person you might want to look up online and read a little bit more about her. She's a very important Enlightenment participant, and also a devoted Christian, too, who had no trouble combining learning and reason with her Christian faith. So salons promoted education among women. This is important that you know that. Women were participants in the discussions, and certainly they were in attendance. And salons became this incredible mixing place of all these different groups. You had philosophers, of course, philosophes, nobility, middle class people, artists were there, women were there. It was like the place to be if you lived in 1760 in Paris. You wanted to be a part of one of these salons. It's where the intellectual life of the city was really taking place. So that's the Enlightenment. We come back next time and look at how the Enlightenment affected politics and how certain monarchs eventually adopted Enlightenment views and made some important reforms in their countries.